When collecting and playing Warhammer 40K, picking an army is one of the first steps. Let's take a tour through the grim darkness of the far future, and see what the various races and factions have to offer. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought I'd make a refresher of my guide for every army in the game. Quite a lot's changed over the last couple of years, so I thought it was high time to update this video to make sure all the information is current. Generally, when picking an army in 40k, I think there's quite a few things that might factor into your decision. How much you actually like the miniatures and their aesthetics on the table, the lore and background of the army, who are they, what are they fighting for, and do they have any particularly compelling stories that really motivate you to collect them, the rules and game mechanics when you have them on the table, do they do anything particularly fun like the Necrons reanimating back and standing up, or the Death Guard laughing off incoming fire with their disgusting resilience, perhaps a little bit about how strong the faction is in game. It might help a little bit if they aren't absolutely bottom of the barrel for strength, but admittedly this does change literally all the time. Games Workshop rebalance things quite regularly, and generally I wouldn't just pick factions for power. You don't want to be left with a whole load of miniatures that you don't really care about when the meta inevitably moves on. Finally, some factions are significantly more expensive to collect than others. For some people that might not be so much of a factor, other people might need to work with the budget, but to be honest, if all things are equal, you may as well go with the one that costs a fair bit less if you like two factions similarly. For the rest of the video, we'll go through each army in turn, talk through each one of these factors, and hopefully just give you a general idea of how it feels to collect and play the faction. If you're starting out, usually a good first step is to pick up the army's codex, and maybe something like some basic troops perhaps, and get some paint on some miniatures and see if you like them. Just briefly, here's the rough overview of armies in 40k at the moment. They're broadly split into the Imperium of Man, the Worshippers of Chaos and the Ruinous Powers, and the various Xenos alien races, several factions of Eldar, two of Tyranids, and then the Tau, Orks and Necrons. You potentially can field a bit of a mixed force of two different things within the same super faction, though generally in 40k it isn't the most encouraged at the moment. Typically armies tend to be a bit stronger and have a few more interesting special rules if they're fielded by themselves. In any case, let's take a look over the factions one by one, and we'll start in the Imperium with the Space Marines. So Space Marines are pretty much the poster boys of Warhammer 40k. Genetically engineered humans to the point where they're kind of superhuman, and they go to war clad in indomitable power armor, wielding some of the best weapons and equipment that the Imperium can muster. Bolters and chainswords are perhaps some of the most iconic weapons in 40k. The Space Marines generally fight as kind of a knightly order in space, organised into monastic chapters, each of which have significantly different heraldry, fighting style, and flaws. I would generally say that if you're looking for an easy faction to get into 40k with, Marines are pretty much it. More people collect them than any other faction. Their range is absolutely enormous, with a ridiculous amount of miniatures available, and they've also received an absolute ton of new kits recently with the advent of Primaris Space Marines, a relatively recent innovation that are bigger and stronger than the rest. Almost every recent Space Marine release has been a Primaris one. It does seem that at some stage Games Workshop might transition to be only selling Primaris Marines. Certainly wouldn't be too surprised if a few of the older Space Marine kits got phased out. That might be something just to bear in mind when you're deciding on purchases. Price-wise, Space Marines also might well be the cheapest army to collect. They're generally quite an elite force, meaning that you don't need all that many models on the table. You get them in the 40k starter set, and they have an absolute ton of start collecting boxes for their various different chapters, so a large part of the range can be got at a discount. Currently, if you want to play Space Marines in-game, the rules are found in their 9th edition Codex Space Marines, plus you have the addition of optional rules with various different supplement codexes, which give you access to a whole load of the chapter-specific units, rules, and stratagems. For example, most of the units are found in the core Codex Space Marines, but if you were playing Black Templars, you might pick up their recent supplement book, and that will give you the rules for things like their knightly vows, chaplain litanies, and special characters. With such a crazy amount of kits and options, Space Marines can make a good stab at virtually any different fighting style. The only thing that they don't really do is mass hordes, as they're all quite elite. You can have infantry forces, tank forces, phalanxes of stomping dreadnoughts, super elite Terminator squads, or biker-themed armies. They're pretty effective both at shooting and in combat. A lot of the best lists will take a mix of the two. Overall, I'd say that Space Marines are currently pretty strong. They've got a ton of supplements, and there's good builds in a lot of them, and as it stands it means that they have quite a bit of flexibility for adapting to how the game changes around them. Talking of which, I thought we'd just briefly go through each of the main Space Marine chapters, and just touch on what makes them unique and if they have any special miniatures. I'd say there's 6 major chapters that are less divergent, a bit more in line with the Codex Astartes and without so many of their own unique datasheets and things. Perhaps first amongst these are Ultramarines. They exemplify battlefield flexibility and tactics, being able to fall back and shoot. They've got a whole load of different character units, including the Lord Commander of the Imperium himself, Brabute Gilliman, and a maybe medium power in-game with some nice redeployment options. The White Scars are all about getting to the enemy fast. They're somewhat Mongol cavalry themed as a chapter, led into battle by Khans on bikes. They're fast, brutal, and very nasty in melee. They've got a couple of unique characters, including Corsaro Khan here, and in general their speed and threat makes them one of the more threatening Space Marine chapters right now. They are quite strong in game. The Raven Guard are the sneaky Spec Ops Space Marines. They like to focus on guerrilla tactics, assassinating enemy characters, and they quite often have Vanguard veterans on jump packs jumping out of the shadows to cut down targets of opportunity. They've got a unique chapter master in Kavan Shrike with his lightning claws. They have quite a lot of sneaky tactics in game with all their stratagems, but unfortunately at the moment they are one of the weaker armies out of the Space Marine chapters. Even gimmicks like being able to deep strike certain models like Centurions aren't quite enough to get them there. The Iron Hands are merciless tacticians that believe the flesh is weak. They're heavily augmented by bionic arms and legs, and have a hefty contingent of dreadnoughts and war machines within their forces. They're generally a bit more of a gunline chapter, have a unique character in Ironfather Phyros, and at the moment I would say they're one of the strongest Space Marine chapters in game. Nice and durable, can pack a powerful alpha strike with things like drop devastators, and work very well supporting dreadnoughts. Next we have the Salamanders, the green-clad sons of Vulcan. They bring the raw might of a dragon to the table, being really quite hard to put down, having lots of durability tactics, and are absolutely murderous whenever a unit can get their hands on a melter gun or a flamer weapon. They've got a couple of unique characters in Vulcan Hestan and Adrax Agaton, and while they enjoyed some serious success to the start of 9th edition, I'd say they're a bit more medium level for the chapters now. They lost out a bit when certain units like Aggressors and Eradicators were toned down early in the edition. Finally, for the more Codex compliant chapters, we have the Imperial Fists. These staunch defenders of terror are very gunline focused, particularly on their bolter drill, and are experts of siege warfare. Again, they just have a couple of their own unique character models, Torgaradon and Captain Lysander, and unfortunately they are one of the weaker chapters in 40k right now. Their chapter tactic does make their bolters quite a bit better, but aside from that their codex just doesn't really offer all that much, not compared with most of the rest. Now we're getting into the chapters that are far less codex compliant, and tend to do things their own way a bit more, with quite a lot of their own unique units. Generally these ones have their own troops choices, a fairly decent character range, and have often had their complete standalone own codexes throughout previous editions. First up we have the Dark Angels, who are a secret and shadowy knightly order, forever trying to track down their fallen brethren who betrayed their legion and the Imperium during the Horus Heresy. For that they make use of their arrow-fast Ravenwing bike squadrons and their deadly hammer of the Deathwing Terminators to first locate the foe and then crush them beneath their might. They've got a pretty extensive miniature range, particularly quite a lot of Ravenwing things, including their Black Knights, Planes and Landspeeders, and having multiple powerful rules for their specialised formations, I would say that they're one of the stronger chapters out of the Marines right now. A lot of their units are just really tough to crack, and they've got a lot of powerful options to support them. Next up, and bitter rivals to the Dark Angels, we have the Space Wolves. Hailing from Fenris, they're basically a chapter full of space Vikings, with a definite fixation on wolves and all things lupine. Again, they've got a pretty large range of miniatures, including things like the half-Space Marine, half-Wolf Wolfen, the Wolf Guard, and the Thunderwolf Cavalry. No prizes for spotting the theme there. As close combat chapters go, I'd say they're medium to strong in power. They've got a good chapter tactic, and lots of decent stratagems to support it, and some powerful unique unit options, including the Wolf Guard and Wolf Guard Terminators. Next we have the Sons of Sanguinius, the Blood Angels. They're angelic tragic heroes with a fatal flaw. The martyrdom of their Primarch Sanguinius leaves them prone to horrific death visions and their gradual descent into the madness that is the Black Rage. Again, they have a very large range of miniatures, maybe most iconically having their own unique jump infantry such as the Sanguinary Guard and the Death Company, and plenty of decent characters, including this nice new resculpt of Chief Librarian Mephiston. In game, they just do melee really well, getting +1 to wound on the charge, so excel with basically anything combat orientated. Despite being one of my favourite chapters, I would say they're around about medium in power level right now. They lost a few really key abilities for getting their Marines into combat in their Codex update, and while still packing a whole load of raw power, maybe are just a small amount behind some of the other Space Marine combat chapters. The Black Templars are perhaps the ultimate example of Space Marines as the Crusading Knights. They're zealous battle brothers fighting from crusade fleets that carve a permanent path of righteousness across the galaxy. They're famed for use of huge Space Marine squads deployed en masse, and cutting their way through Xenos and heretics alike with little more than righteous zeal and a chainsword. As it goes, they have a fairly small range compared with things like the Dark Angels, Space Wolves and Blood Angels, but all of their major squads were recently redone in Primaris form, so you've got Primaris Crusader squads, Sword Brethren, 3 unique characters, and some unique character models. The reimagined models have stuck pretty closely to the previous fluff for the chapter, and I think that most people are really happy with the way their models look right now. Currently in-game, they're a brutal assault chapter with some interesting tricks. I quite like their vow that they can take before the battle to give them useful buffs like combat benefits or 5+ invul save across everyone, and I quite like some of their unique litanies and their ability to hand out little relics to some of their squad members. I think all of this adds up to them being relatively strong as a Space Marine chapter, though maybe a little bit untested as to whether or not they'll stand the test of time. Their codex didn't come out all that long before I'm recording this. Finally, for the more unique Space Marines that still use the core codex, we have the Death Watch. These guys basically represent the Spec Ops Xenos Hunters of the Inquisition, a really cool little force that's drawn from diverse chapters and led together by a watch captain for certain missions. They've got all sorts of fancy toys that standard Space Marines don't gain access to, quite like their teleport tactics and special issue ammunition, and they've got a range about similar sort of size to the Black Templars, quite a nice Firstborn Death Watch veteran squad, a Corvus Blackstar, and a few characters. Again, I'd say they're probably one of the stronger Space Marine factions. Those mixed kill teams in the troop slot can certainly do a lot of work, perhaps more in melee than shooting if anything, parking some enormously tough squads on objectives, and if you want a weirder take on the army, it can make some of the best dreadnought castles in the faction. I've got quite a few fun options though, including tailored stratagems to combating different types of Xenos. Moving on to our final flavour of Space Marines, we have the Grey Knights, and these guys are perhaps the most divergent of the lot. Demon hunters from Titan with super specialised war gear, and every single member in their chapter is a psyker. From their shadowy base of operations, the prognosticars predict the arrival of demon incursions wherever they might erupt, dispatching hyper-elite task forces across the Imperium to seal the breaches in the warp when they arise. Due to their nature of the most existential threat to the Imperium itself, they deploy both the best technological might that mankind has to offer and combine that with their psychic powers and rituals to cast the greatest servants of the Dark Gods back into the warp. Miniatures-wise, the Grey Knights are locked out of most of the core Space Marine options, including any of the new shiny Primaris Marines, and they have a small, slightly older range of plastic models, mainly centered around 3 main boxes: the powered armored Strike Marines that you can see here, their Terminators, and their Dread Knight. They're perhaps not the newest of miniatures, and the Dread Knight itself does gain a little bit of criticism on the aesthetics front, but I think for the most part they do hold up okay. Price-wise, I think they are one of the cheaper factions to get into still. They're currently still waiting for their Combat Patrol box to come out, which should be coming in the not too distant future, but even so, their armies tend to be even more elite than Space Marines, so relatively few models do go quite a long way. In-game, they're really quite powerful at the moment, gifted with a recent 9th edition codex that has really made them quite scary, and their playstyle will usually be a whole load of troops with teleporters, close-range shooting, and quality melee, all backed up by a decent amount of psychic destruction and buffs. Dread Knights in particular at the moment are very, very scary indeed, being quite tough and fast and doing every phase of the game pretty well. Certainly one of the stronger factions in 40k, though I really wouldn't be too surprised if they got some sort of nerf to Dread Knights in the future. I think that could easily happen in a future chapter approved or balanced data slate. In any case, if you want to collect a hyper-elite army of silver-armoured psychic demon hunters, then the Grey Knights might well be for you. Next up we come to the Adepta Sororitas, aka the Sisters of Battle, the all-female order of warrior nuns dedicated to protecting the ecclesiarchy and defenders of the imperial faith. For a non-Space Marine force, they're really quite well supplied, their basic sisters being armed with power armour and bolters, though they do have a particular preference for purging the heretics with flamers and melter fire, burning the unclean out of existence. Their faith in the Emperor doesn't merely seem to be a dogmatic thing either. In battle, they seem to be mysteriously supported by his divine will, and it's not uncommon for the sisters' prayers to be answered in the hour of their direst need. In terms of miniatures, for much of the last couple of decades, the sisters were left with a whole load of quite old metal kits, but Games Workshop has really given them a massive army refresh in recent years, a ton of new plastic kits that seem to have been largely very well received indeed. Most of them are really quite detailed and look incredibly striking, and they've gone from having a relatively small unit pool to having quite a decent number of options. Of course, recent Games Workshop plastic kits do generally come with a price tag attached. Sisters are one of the more expensive Imperial factions to play, though I'd argue perhaps not the most expensive, largely because of a quite good combat patrol box that has quite a lot of their more commonly used units enclosed within. Aside from the Rhino, they are monopose miniatures, but I'm still a really big fan of that set. In 9th edition, they are one of the armies that have got their codex already, a relatively recent army, and they do have one set of supplemental rules in the Warzone Charadon expansion if you want a few more rules for the Order of Our Martyred Lady, though these are definitely non-essential. Their general playstyle tends to be quite infantry heavy at the moment, a whole load of power armoured elite infantry that tend to hit very hard indeed, though might be a little bit fragile to return enemy fire, only being toughness 3 for the most part. Perhaps one of the most unique things about the army is their quite cool miracle dice mechanic. It allows you to boost certain rolls unexpectedly and get the exact result that you need when you most need it, and I think it's quite a good way of representing their faith in the Emperor in game. Overall, I think they're a really solid army, certainly a scary force in the hands of the best players, though maybe just need a little bit more careful command than some, as if you get your units hit hard before they hit the enemy, then it's not going to end well for the sisters. In any case, if you want to command a convent of fanatical warrior nuns dedicated to the Emperor's cause, then join the Adepta Sororitas and let's burn some witches. Next up we have the Adeptus Mechanicus, often shortened to the Admech, and these guys are the tech priests of Mars and worshippers of the Omnissiah, mankind's machine god. The Adeptus Mechanicus provides the Imperium's war material, but is a powerful force in its own right, defending its forge worlds with legions of mass Skitarii, mechanically augmented humans to the extent where there isn't really that much humanity left in them. The Admech forces make programmed attacks, bearing devastating and esoteric weapons, souped up las cannons, and radioactive war gear. They definitely feel like an army that has a few steampunk vibes, particularly among some of their new kits, the bat-winged Taraxi and Archaeopters. The Admech do already have a pretty reasonable range, though they are one of the more recent additions to the 40k army lineup, and were often a fan kit-bashed army for quite a number of years. Because of that, all of their miniatures are pretty new sculpts. I really like the aesthetic that these guys have going on, a nice combination of flowing robes, mechanically augmented things, and religious trappings. I think they look like really quite a cool army on the table, and lots of their squads can make 2 different options, having a dual kit build. Unfortunately, again that does come with a downside. I'd say they're perhaps one of the most expensive armies that you can collect in 40k right now, perhaps a slightly unfortunate combination of their units being pretty pricey, and also not really all that elite, not compared with things like Space Marines. They do have a combat patrol box which could help take the edge off a bit, but still an Admech army is going to cost you significantly more than say a Space Marine one. In game at the moment, Admech do have a recent 9th edition codex, and again like the sisters do have some supplemental rules in Warzone Charadon, and hopefully they're spread out across both books, a Metallica supplement and Cybernetica cohort in the first, and then a Veteran Skitarii one in the second. Again, those are absolutely non-mandatory for playing the faction. I would certainly start out with just the codex. Playstyle wise, the Admech are really famed for being a heavy gunline army. Things like their Cognis las cannons are really fearsome anti-tank with damage D3+3, and even despite some of their recent nerfs, their rangers put out a silly amount of strength 4 shooting. That can all be souped up further with powerful commanders such as Skitarii Marshals and the Tech Priests with the Holy Orders, and they've perhaps got some of the stronger whole army buffs, the Canticles of the Omnissiah and the Doctrina Imperatives. You can potentially get both of those at once if you're playing a Mars Forge world. That's certainly not to say that they can't do melee though. They've got a fair few close assault units too, and riser lists could certainly tear things up. Power-wise, in 9th edition they were originally insanely strong, completely dominating tournaments for a fair amount of time by just hoovering the enemy off the table, but Games Workshop swung the balance hammer hard, and now I describe them as a far more mid-tier army, almost every single competitive unit taking a bit of a hit. Still though, while their datasheets might not bring quite as much raw power as before, I think they can still shine, though need a bit more skill to do so. If you like the idea of grim, merciless robed warriors annihilating the enemy with heavy weapons, then your logic engines might prefer the Adeptus Mechanicus as an army. Next up, while Space Marines might be the glory boys of the Imperium, it's the Astra Militarum or the Imperial Guard who hold the line. Countless billions of warriors across the Imperium, armed with lasguns and bayonets, and fighting to keep back the hordes of demons and Xenos with little more than grim determination, and a never-ending war of attrition. The Guard are perhaps closest to a 20th century military force, massed ranks of infantry with cheaply mass-produced lasguns, supported by lumbering ungainly Lehman Russ tanks, and some devastating artillery strikes from behind the front line. Compared with a fair few of the other factions in 40k, the Guard do feel quite grounded, and may be easier for a lot of people to resonate with, rather than superhuman space monks in power armor, or many of the varied Xenos horrors. The Guard also have the Tempestus Scions within their codex as a sort of stormtrooper elite force, They kind of represent the scalpel that accompanies the hammer blow that is the Guard, and drop in on do or die missions to land a crippling blow on the enemy army. Miniatures wise, the Guard are perhaps one of the older lineups in the 40k range, and have got quite a lot of old kits and resin models amongst their range, though compared with some armies, really quite a big choice of different units. In the past, the Guard had really quite a lot of different regiments realised in metal miniatures, but all of those have been discontinued now. The choices are Arcadians, Kaschans, or the new Death Corps of Krieg. Quite a lot of other miniature companies though do make some stand-in bits for the Guard if you do want to customise them a bit and give them your own feel, and it's not impossible Games Workshop might come back to some of these relics in the future. Again, I would argue that the Astra Militarum are perhaps one of the more expensive armies to collect in 40k. This time not because their kits are massively more expensive than the other things that are released at the moment, but just because you need quite a lot of models, their units just not being quite as elite as things like Space Marines for example. I can attest that second-hand miniatures can be a pretty good way of building up a collection. As an army that's been around for a long time without many changes, there tends to be quite a good second-hand market for current models. Currently the Guard are still represented in 9th with their 8th edition codex, plus a couple of expansions, the Greater Good from the Psychic Awakening series. That one brings a few fun things like tank aces and scion regiments, and a more recent Cadian supplement in the Warzone Octarius book. They generally lead themselves to a bit of an attrition playstyle, lots of not so very elite units holding the line, guardsmen bravely sacrificing themselves to hold objectives, while hopefully the big guns at the back pound the enemy army to dust. Even despite some of their best tricks though, the Guard really are quite weak in 9th edition, and they're one of the armies that I think just needs an across-the-board buff. Games Workshop gave their Leman Russes a 2+ armor save in an errata recently, but I'm not sure it's quite enough to turn their fortunes around. In general though, building a Guard army is a bit of a labour of love. It takes quite a long time just due to the amount of models, but it's an incredibly rewarding one, and I've certainly found the army great fun to collect myself. Next up we have the Emperor's own super soldiers, the Adeptus Custodes, and these golden armoured super elite Guardians of Terror are essentially the Space Marines of Space Marines, genetically and physically augmented with the Emperor's own genetics, and every soldier basically the equivalent of a hero of another faction's army. In the era Indomitus, the Custodes have been mobilised once more by Rabute Guilliman into a more of an aggressive fighting force, no longer just sitting around and guarding Terror itself, but often leading excursions into the galaxy to take the battle to the enemy. Miniatures wise, the Custodes being played as a full army is quite a novelty in 40k. Their first full codex came out in 8th edition, and in terms of plastic miniatures the range is quite small. They've got their standard Custodes, their Terminators, Sisters of Silence and Bikes, and that's largely it for Games Workshop plastic models. They are pretty cool and very detailed indeed, but it doesn't lend itself to too many different playstyles. If you collect Custodes, you'd have to decide whether or not you're going to venture into the realm of Forge World. They produce a whole bunch of resin models, and the addition of them make the Custodes feel a lot more like a complete army. They've got some transports, battle tanks, and a whole manner of different flavours of Custode infantry, as well as some pretty nice looking dreadnoughts. For the most part, if you're buying the Games Workshop plastic kits, they are again one of the cheapest armies to collect, if not perhaps the cheapest, mainly because the models are so elite that you don't need that many of them to make a full force. But you will lose a bit of that value if you go too heavy into the Forge World line. They will charge themselves a premium above the standard Games Workshop prices. In-game at the moment, they're shortly to receive a 9th edition codex that's coming out in January, so at the moment there's a fair few question marks as to how they're going to play. As well as that though, if you want the actual data sheets for the rest of their army, they're going to be in the Imperial Armour Compendium, the one that came out towards the start of 9th for all of their Forge World models. In general, the Custodes tend to play as a hyper-elite infantry force, maybe supported by a fair few bikes and dreadnoughts, all of which have a 2+ armor save and a ton of wounds, and bring some seriously quality melee when they get stuck in. Throughout 9th so far, they've generally got on very well with the 9th edition missions. Putting durable and dangerous units on objectives is what 9th edition is all about, and while they're already strong, it's hard to imagine them getting any weaker with a new codex, particularly when they're going to be getting some things like layered buffs with things like their new shield host rules and their martial katars. In general, I'd argue that Custodes are a relatively quick and easy army to get into 40k with, and bring a decent amount of raw power to the table, and you get the satisfaction of commanding some of the most elite troops in the entire game. Next up, and rounding out the major factions of the Imperium, are the Imperial Knights, a big stompy army of super heavy walkers that plays very differently to most other factions in the game, and in the lore they're represented by noble households, whose members vie for the positioning and the claiming of their super heavy knight suits, stomping into battle alongside other Imperial forces, and fighting to bring honour to their household and destruction to the enemies of the Emperor. I think there's quite a bit of scope for creativity with the Imperial Knights, as they're such massive models you can really go to town on making them your own, whether it's with their own heraldry or conversions. You could perhaps say that they're in a fairly similar place to Custodes model-wise. They've got 3 really quite nice new Games Workshop kits. This Questoris one that you can see here that builds an enormous variety of different wargear options, the mini Armiger Knights that operate as a support role, and the big, slightly more shooting-orientated Dominus classes that pack a whole bunch of heavy firepower. Again, similar to the Custodes, they have quite a lot of different knights offered by Forge World as well. Again, their rules can be found in the Imperial Armour Compendium and give you some other interesting ways to run the faction. I would say that they're another fairly easy way to break into 40k. They're fairly cheap to get a 2,000 point army together, as you don't really need all that many models to put on the table to get there, even if the ones that you do are pretty big. Again though, they are going to be a touch on the pricier side if you are running Forge World things. They're a faction that's currently awaiting their 9th edition codex. No real hints as to when that's going to come yet. They've got their 8th edition one with a fairly decent choice of models, and then that's backed up with some extra rules in the Engine War supplement, and a few more extra rules for House Raven if you're going for them in the Warzone Octarius supplements. Again, I'd perhaps argue that most of those don't give you enormous power boosts. I'd just start with the core codex. Playstyle wise, I would bear in mind that the army can be a bit limited. In general, the opponent's going to be playing a game of can they kill the super heavy walkers, and maybe just testing how much anti-tank firepower they chose to bring along. It's certainly not bad when mixed in with other games, but it can get a bit wearing if you're just playing the same thing over and over. Basically, knights only really have the 2 major playstyles though if you're going pure. Either going to be a few big knights with a couple of armigers, or you could just field a mass armiger swarm with an absolute ton of little walkers dashing around the board. Knights can be a bit of a power trip to play though. You don't have to spend all that much time moving models, you just stomp your enormous walkers around the board, delete something in shooting, and then hopefully charge and kick something to death in melee. To shake things up, you could always add some allies in, maybe something like some Guard Tempestus Scions, or perhaps some other units for screening and objective capturing. Power-wise at the moment, I'd say they're around about the low to medium power range. Compared with an 8th edition where they were really quite dominant, they maybe just lack a bit of the raw power they need just to sweep the opponent aside. But a recent update on the balance data slate did mean that their armigers got a load better at taking objectives in their own right, making the Knight faction a bit more viable compared with the other armies. In any case, if you want to play 40k with just a few enormous models, and stomp gloriously towards the enemy all guns blazing, then the Imperial Knights can be really good fun. Finally, I thought it was worth touching on the mini-factions of the Imperium, the ones that aren't really pure armies in their own right, and perhaps best loosely brought together under the Imperial Agents banner. These guys comprise of quite a few different forces. The forces of the Inquisition, who have ultimate authority to requisition the other armies from the Imperium, allied assassins that you can seed throughout the ranks of your army to take down a key battlefield target, and rogue traders with their motley crews of explorators, representing the Imperium on frontier worlds. Generally these forces don't tend to take on entire armies in their own right, but might try and support other Imperial forces when they contact the enemy. Miniature-wise, it's a bit of a mixed bag for these. They don't really enjoy the same sort of support as plenty of the other factions. The assassin miniatures are all quite nice, a fairly recent update for them. The Inquisitors are about 50-50, a few of them are nice new plastic miniatures, where a lot of them are really quite old resin ones. And the Rogue Traders have some very nice models, including their trusty Canis, though weirdly enough Games Workshop isn't selling them at the moment, despite recently publishing some rules for them. I feel like there's at least some chance they'll return, though they currently aren't on sale right now. In-game, the Inquisitors and the Rogue Traders are represented in some of these latest Warzone campaign books, and you can find the Assassin's datasheet in the War of the Spider book, one of the Psychic Awakening ones. I wouldn't be too surprised though if they get their rules redone and included in a future Warzone book. Playstyle-wise, it's generally what these things can add to your forces in-game. The Inquisitors are pretty interesting. They can provide some decent psychic buffs, such as 5+ invul saves or ignoring Overwatch. Each of the 4 assassins do their specialised role pretty well, though they do always feel like a bit of a luxury pick at 100 points, and the Rogue Traders are perhaps a bit more random, and I don't think they work quite as well with other Imperial forces, to be honest. A bit more of a fun and fluffy choice really. Power-wise, I feel like usually these guys are either going to be auto-includes or really quite niche. At the moment, I'd say they're pretty niche, to be honest. Inquisitors occasionally pop up from time to time to provide some useful buffs, and occasionally an Imperial army will make use of an assassin, maybe a Calexus for some anti-psyker, or a Calidus to mess with command points and hopefully jump on a key target. In general though, they can just add a bit more fun and flavour to your Imperial armies. If you've been running the same thing for quite a while, maybe throwing in an Inquisitor or Assassin could be a fun way to shake things up. Leaving the Emperor's Light behind us now, let's make our descent into Chaos. and we'll start out with the first among traitors, the Chaos Space Marines. The Chaos Space Marines are the successors of the Space Marines that betrayed the Emperor in the Horus Heresy, fully half of the legions falling prey to the temptations of the Dark Gods, ultimately causing the near death of the Emperor and his permanent entombment on the Golden Throne. Chased back to refuge in the Eye of Terror, they have lurked there for millennia, the influences of the warp corrupting their armour, weapons, and very bodies, and now once more the Chaos Marines are free upon the galaxy, bursting through the Cadian Gate of the Eye of Terror at the height of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. Much like the Loyalist Space Marines, all of their legions have their own quirks, preferences, and fighting styles, and have a whole wealth of lore behind them, both dating from the Horus Heresy book series, all the way to their current state in the 41st millennium. Miniatures-wise, the Chaos Marines weren't in a great shape until relatively recently. They had a big release in the middle of 8th edition, where lots of key kits got updated. Their standard Chaos Space Marines, Terminators and Havocs are all looking really quite nice now, though they do still have quite a few older and resin kits amongst the range. They've been rumoured and teased to have a really quite big release coming in 2022 though. It seems like when their codex does eventually drop, it's going to be accompanied by a pretty decent release. Price-wise, I'd say they're a low to mid-price army. Nowhere near as many value options as the Space Marines get, but again they still are quite an elite army comparatively, and their start collecting box that they have allows you to get an absolutely whopping amount of points on the table for how much it costs. It wouldn't exactly be the most optimised list in the world, but you could get into 40k very cheaply indeed, just with a few copies of that and a few support units. In game at the moment, the Chaos Marines have been looking forward to their 9th edition codex for a very long time now. They're currently still with their 8th edition decks, plus a whole bunch of supplemental Legion rules in the Warzone Charadon book, which as they go I think is one of the better supplements. You do get a fair amount of rules for each Legion, a bunch of different stratagems, relics and warlord traits. You can also field them as a Creations of Bile army as well. Those rules are found in the War of the Spider Psychic Awakening book. Playstyle wise, the Chaos Marines can do a fair few different ones, again quite dependent on which Legion you're playing. As a general rule though, they'll usually be at least fairly elite infantry, maybe supported by a few chaff cultists. They tend to be more melee focused than the standard Space Marines, preferring to cut you down in combat rather than shoot you to death at range, and they've got a fair amount of support for their various demon engine creations within the codex. You can make a force fairly themed around these warp-infused monstrosities, maybe buffed with a few key pieces such as Masters of Possession or Lords Discordant. Power-wise, the Chaos Marines I'd put in the low to medium power bracket. When all of their various buffs and psychic powers come together, they can make really scary hard hitters, but a lot of their data sheets just tend to be a bit underwhelming for their raw stats for their cost. Recently the balanced data slate gave all of their combat units a small buff, so they're a bit more dangerous there. Overall, if you want to combine the superhuman prowess of the Space Marines with the dark glory of the Chaos Gods, then the Chaos Marines might be the ones for you. In terms of the actual personality of some of their legions, both Death Guard and Thousand Sons have their own books, so we'll get onto them in a second, but otherwise there's quite a few that mainly just operate out of this codex. Black Legion are maybe the archetypical Chaos Space Marines, a quite general purpose and undivided Chaos Legion of driven crusaders, helmed by Abaddon the Despoiler himself. Both him and Harken Worldclaimer are some really nice miniatures I think. In game they tend to focus mainly around Terminators or Space Marines, though to be honest I think that the Legion in general is pretty weak aside from Abaddon. The main reason that you want to run them is to get him, as he's one of the strongest datasheets in the game of 40k right now. Fairly fitting for one of the archetypical bad guys. Devoted to Khorne we have the World Eaters, the blood-crazed Butchers of Angron, and potentially one of the armies that Games Workshop might get around to releasing their own codex for in due course. I think they're holding off on updating the Berserker kit until that happens, but at least they have this nice new reimagined model of Khan the Betrayer, who's quite a cool model to lead the faction. In general they don't seem to see as much play as some of the other Chaos Marine legions, but that might well change a little bit with the changes to Death to the False Emperor. Khorne Berserkers were already crazily destructive in combat, and now they're more so. The Emperor's Children are the legion that fell to Slanesh, drug-fueled monstrosities dedicated to perfection and indulging their every whim. Unfortunately, they've perhaps aged even worse than the Berserkers model-wise. The Noise Marines are a fairly horrible resin kit, aside from of course this limited edition sculpt that Games Workshop came out with. He is nice and mad. Lucius the Eternal could do with an update, but in general the Legion does remain quite strong in game. Being able to guarantee some easy charges out of Deep Strike with their Terminators are nice, and their Noise Marines that they can field as troops are some pretty nice damage dealers for the Chaos Army. Otherwise we have the 4 Undivided Legions. The Iron Warriors are also quite strong in game, Masters of Siege Warfare and Demon Smiths. Model wise they just have this one unique Warpsmith and they're quite strong when they're used with a lot of demon engines and one of their warlord traits. The word bearers are the demonic ritualists of Lorgar, dedicated to converting the galaxy to the worship of chaos, and they'll often have great numbers of demonic possessed within their ranks that can become very scary in game with some of their warlord traits and stratagems. The Night Lords are the midnight-clad terror troops, brutal murderers often striking from jump packs from the shadows. They've just got the one quite old unique Lord miniature, and they're fairly weak in game. Leadership just isn't relevant against quite a few armies, unfortunately. And finally we have the Alpha Legion, the clandestine and enigmatic infiltrators that no one really knows their true agenda. They don't have their own unique miniatures in 40k, and are maybe a bit more ranged in focus compared with the other Chaos Marines, with some nice tricks like intercept stratagems, pre-game deployment shenanigans, and stopping certain units getting shot from enemy fire. There's also plenty more warbands and renegade chapters, including things like the before-mentioned creations of Bile, where you can make some massively roided up Chaos Marines to represent Mr. Bile's tinkering with the Emperor's designs. Overall, there's really quite a lot of character to be had in the Chaos Space Marines, and you can really pursue quite a different themes within worship of the Dark Gods. Moving on to the properly fleshed out legions though, first we have the Death Guard. These guys are the sons of Mortarion, and fell to the foul gifts of Nurgle during the Horus Heresy, rendering the army bloated and diseased plague marines in a permanent state of semi-death. Their bloated and corpulent bodies are nigh unkillable, and make war in a grueling war of attrition, with plenty of disease-laced or biological weapons amongst their ranks. They also feature a good number of demon engines amongst their ranks, plague-belching feated bloat drones, or plague-burst crawlers. Miniature-wise, they didn't used to be their own army for quite some time. They were only separated out from the standard Chaos Space Marines at the start of 8th edition, when they were gifted really quite a nice new plastic range, perhaps the highlights being their new Plague Marines, Mortarion himself, 2 types of unique Terminators, and a few different demon engines. They're quite nice detailed miniatures, though they do certainly have their own aesthetics. Hopefully you like Space Marines with a fair few guts and tentacles hanging out of them. Price-wise, they were perhaps initially one of the easiest armies to get into, being in the 8th edition starter sets, but those boxes have unfortunately gone away in 9th, meaning they're a touch more expensive to get into than they were. Still, they are quite an elite force. You don't need as many models as some of the other things. They do have a combat patrol box, but that's mainly there just to get you loads of poxwalkers, and it's usually not the sort of one that you'd want to buy multiple times, unless you really are going for full zombie horde mode. Their current rules are in the 9th edition codex that came out towards the start of 2021. They do have a supplemental formation in the first Warzone Charadon book. That one's the Terminus S Strike Force, and can give you a different sort of playstyle, one that doesn't involve any demon engines at all. Generally, the most typical Death Guard armies tend to revolve around elite infantry and Terminators, backed up by a fair amount of Poxwalker zombies to hold objectives, plus perhaps a bit of scary firepower with things like the Plague Burst Crawlers to back them up. You can certainly play around with a fair few different themes for them. They can get a fair bit of firepower by adding in Forge World Dreads. You can go very heavy on the Poxwalkers indeed, taking up to 100 of them, or you can add in Mortarion himself for an awesome centerpiece that deals out quite a nice amount of hurt. Power-wise, I'd say the Death Guard are certainly decently strong, maybe fairly resilient, and quite easy to play with as well. They might not punish you for making mistakes quite as much as certain other armies. They've got some fun rules going on too. -1 damage on virtually everything makes them really resistant to things like damage 2 weapons, and their contagions of Nurgle make the enemy troops actively weaker when they get close to them, all the better for dragging them down in close combat or with close-range volleys of bolt fire. Overall, if you want a super resilient force of diseased marines trudging their way towards the enemy and laying them low in a brutal war of attrition, then the Death Guard might be for you. If you prefer the magical manipulation of Tzeentch though to the festering gifts of Nurgle, then let's move on to the Thousand Sons. The Legion of Magnus the Red had a thirst for exoteric lore during the Horus Heresy, and their many psychers delved into forbidden secrets and the pursuit of dangerous heretical knowledge. Tzeentch began to favour their legion with ever more mutations and gifts, with much of the legion devolving into a semi-human state, the sorcerer Ahriman choosing to rectify this with a great rubric, stopping the decay of their legion by the somewhat brutal method of entombing the brothers within their own armour, and much of the legion are now mere clanking automata, animated by warp magic, any trace of the Space Marine inside reduced to mere dust. These squads of somewhat Egyptian-themed Space Marines are commanded by sorcerers, the only living and breathing members of the Thousand Sons left. These arcane individuals constantly scheming and plotting in great cults of magic. Their current miniature lineup is a small but very nice plastic range. I really quite like their miniatures for the Rubric Marines, Scarab Terminators, and their sorcerers. They have their Primarch Magnus that you can field in battle, and interestingly they're supported by a bunch of Tzeentch kits that were ported directly from Age of Sigmar, the fantasy game, with units like Zangors, Zanger Enlightened, and the Mutalith Vortex Beast. They certainly add a different flavour to the army, though I think there's some debate as to how well they fit in with the aesthetic of the rest of the Legion. Price-wise, generally the Thousand Sons are in a pretty good place. The army is really quite an elite one, and quite a character-heavy one at that. It means that you usually won't need too many squads of rubrics plus some sorcerers, and you've got yourself a fairly workable army already. Like the Grey Knights, hopefully they should have a combat patrol box coming out relatively soon, but Games Workshop haven't said when that will be. Their current rules in-game are from their recent 9th edition codex, which I think in general did quite a good job, really bringing the focus back to the rubric Marines and the Terminators, and not just hordes of Zangors. In-game they'll generally play as fairly slow, indomitable phalanxes of rubrics and Terminators, pouring down a bunch of Inferno bolts on the enemy with some decent AP, and usually screening a fair amount of sorcerers, devastating the enemy with their magic, and buffing up the squads till they're very hard to kill. As armies go, I'd say they're a bit more of a thinking army. If you don't plot out their psychic phase and how you're going to spend things like their Cabal points mechanic, they just won't achieve the same sort of power. Overall though, when they're at their best, I think they're a mid to strong army in 9th. They certainly secure objectives well, and can do a decent job of chewing through the enemy while they do so. If you want to collect an army of vaguely Egyptian-themed Space Marine sorcerers and automata, then you could please Tzeentch by choosing the Thousand Sons. Next up we have the Chaos Demons, and the physical manifestations of the will of the Chaos Gods, pouring from the very warp itself. The gods of chaos are fueled by the emotions and psyche of the mortal races, Khorne representing anger and rage, Nurgle disease, death and decay, Tzeentch scheming, plotting, treason and arcane law, and Slaanesh hedonism, pleasure, perfectionism and depravity. The Chaos Gods often gain access to the mortal plane through the minds of Psykers, which, if they aren't careful with their gifts, can unwittingly unleash vast horrors on their world, transformed into little more than living portals through which the forces of chaos can march through. They can also be unleashed by warp storms and summoned by great rituals, and transform entire worlds or sections of space into little more than playgrounds for the thirsting gods, continuing their war against each other as part of the great game. Never mind any mortals that get in the way, that doesn't really bear thinking about. Miniatures-wise, the Chaos Demon army is kind of 4 mini-armies, each of the main deities having a decent amount of troops for their faction. Most of them have their own infantry, cavalry, greater demons, characters, and chariots. A few of them are a bit more dated than others. They have managed to get the majority of the range out of fine-cast resin now though, and in particular the HQ section for the demons is incredibly bloated. There's quite a ridiculous amount of both generic and special characters that you can choose from. Price-wise, I'd say they're a fairly mid-range army to collect. They do have some pretty decent start collecting bundles that bring down the cost of the army, but again, like many of Games Workshop kits, some of the new shiny plastics are a bit more expensive, and for the most part the Chaos Demons don't tend to be all that elite, so you might need quite a few of them. If you start in the faction though, then those discount bundles are a good place to start from. In the current game, they're still represented by their 8th edition codex, though they do have quite a lot of supplemental content elsewhere. A whole ton of their new datasheets are in the Engine War Psychic Awakening book, and the rules for their very nice new Be'lakor model are in the latest Warzone Charadon expansion, sorry, not Octarius as I wrote here. In general, their playstyle does tend to be very melee heavy. They are in many ways a fantasy army ported into space, and certainly one advantage of collecting Chaos Demons is that you can use the same miniatures in both Warhammer Age of Sigmar and in 40k if you should see fit. The different gods all have their own style. Khorne just goes in for murderous melee damage, Slaanesh is arrow fast and hits with a flurry of attacks, Nurgle likes to play the war of attrition and grind the enemy down, and Tzeentch will typically like to fry the enemy from a safe distance with a bunch of magical warp fire and psychic spells. Power-wise, I'd say they're overall fairly medium. I'd say the average Chaos army that's just thrown together from a whole bunch of miniatures won't usually be that strong, but some of their strongest builds can be quite scary. In particular, multiple Keepers of Secrets backed up by Be'lakor is maybe one of their go-to builds right now. A bunch of first-turn charges with scary models can be kind of hard to counter for some armies. Overall, if you want to swamp the galaxy in a tide of warp-spawned horrors, Chaos Demons might be for you. Finally, for the Dark Gods, we have the forces of the Chaos Knights, the dark mirror of their Imperial counterparts, the fallen households that pledge their allegiance to chaos. Their hulls altered and twisted by the warp, their armour often studded with spikes, and many of them gain unnatural abilities for throwing their lot in with the Dark Gods. Miniatures-wise, the Chaos Knights aren't all that well represented. They only have the one dedicated Chaos Knight kit so far, the one that you can see here. Otherwise, in general, you just use the Loyalist Knight kits, and if you want to, you can chaos them up a bit, get your hands on a bunch of extra chaos bits from somewhere, and start gluing on some spikes. They're rumoured to have at least one other flavour of Chaos Knight coming with a codex in 2022, so they might have another dedicated kit soon, but that remains to be seen. Price-wise, I'd say they're relatively inexpensive. Again, you can just get your hands on a few really big models and call it done. Though just like the standard Knights, if you do start making use of a lot of their Forge World models, that is going to be a bit more pricey. In-game, their current rules are found in their 8th edition codex. I believe in terms of full factions on this list, they are the newest one in the game right now. And like their Imperial Knight cousins, they got a bunch of extra special rules in the Engine War supplement in Psychic Awakening. That one was fairly meaningful for them. They gained access to their Knight household things, which was quite a decent buff. Playstyle, much like the Imperial Knights, they're an army of super heavy walkers, so you're not going to have enormous scope for changing things up each game. Perhaps one of the most interesting things about the Knights is that you can run them as either Infernal Knights or Iconoclast Knights. The Infernal ones get powerful bonuses like souping up one gun to insane levels of damage each turn at the cost of taking a few mortal wounds, and the Iconoclast ones are pretty much monstrous in combat, getting extra AP and attacks. Again, like the Imperial Knights, I put them to around about low to medium power level, maybe a little bit better than previously now their Armiger War Dogs can secure objectives well. Overall, if you want a big army of super heavy walkers, but like spikes and dislike the Corpse Emperor, then maybe a twisted household of Chaos Knights might be for you. Finally, we come to the alien forces of Xenos, and we'll start out with the Craftworld Eldar, aka the Eldari or Ynnari. The Eldar are basically a race of doomed space elves who have fled the fall of their great empire across void-bearing ships called Craftworlds, bringing with them much of the advanced technology and accumulated lore of a great empire, and bitterly fighting for survival amidst the races that they feel are inferior to them. Eldar society is advanced and highly militaristic, with almost every citizen being able to bear arms in their time of need should the Craftworld need them to defend their home. Many of the Eldar choose to excel in a certain aspect of war, one of the facets of destruction of the war god Cain, and when battle comes they'll often make war in a glittering host, led by some of the most powerful psykers in the galaxy, arrow-quick jet bikes buzzing alongside, and perhaps supported by mighty wraith constructs that bear the consciousness of their fallen forebears. Miniatures-wise, the Eldar are perhaps the oldest miniature range currently in the game, with a lot of kits that are crying out for an update and have been for a really long time. Most of their various aspect warriors are still in resin, which isn't ideal, and on top of that, a fair few of their vehicles and characters are also pretty dated. It does seem though that Games Workshop are gearing up for a really big revamp of the Eldar range, which by all accounts looks like it's going to be dropping sometime in 2022. I'd certainly be looking to see exactly what the Eldar get before committing too heavily to miniatures that might just get replaced. Price-wise, I'd say they're fairly moderate to expensive. A lot of the range being resin, it is a bit costly, though at least compared with some factions they are quite elite still. You don't need quite as many hordes of them on the table. In-game, they're represented by their 8th edition codex, supplemented by the War of the Phoenix expansion book, and this does add a fair amount of power to the army with a new psychic discipline and some powerful custom Craftworld traits. Hopefully though, a new codex won't be too far away, as they're one of the factions that aren't performing so great in-game right now. Playstyle-wise, the Eldar can muster a fair few different ways of fighting. They usually tend to be at least fairly fast and fragile though, besides those wraith constructs. Lots of specialised squads doing just one job and doing it well, typically coordinated by a powerful Farseer Psyker to guide the strands of fate into a favourable outcome for the battle. There are a fair few options for playing them though. You could go really heavy into infantry and transports, make shoals of fast vehicle armies with heavyish firepower, or a Ghost Warrior army with a bunch of Wraith units that the enemy will struggle to remove. Power-wise, I would say that the Eldar are currently quite weak right now. They really could do with a bit of help from a new book. If they get tuned up in any sort of similar way to their Drukhari cousins did, then it could be good news for them. Talking of which, we come to the fallen Eldar of the Drukhari. They survived the fall of their empire by hiding in the Webway, and continuing their depraved practices just as they did before. The Webway city of Comera is a vast sprawling expanse, inhabited by various warring cabals, cults and covens, and generally strike out of the Webway only to make war, take prisoners and inflict pain on the enemy, which sustains and nourishes them. They'll typically fight from fast attack skimmers, only touching the ground long enough to deal some death blows to the enemy before re-embarking, and carrying luckless souls back to the Dark City, where they might meet a grisly end in the gladiatorial arenas, or becoming raw parts for Homunculus's crazed designs. The army itself is sort of broadly split into Kabbalite warriors, the main military force, the Witch Cult gladiators, and the Homunculus Coven flesh crafters, Usually they'll work together as a combined force to make a Drukhari army. Miniatures wise, the Drukhari army I think really stands up pretty well. Most of it came out a bit over 10 years ago now, though I do think that the majority of the sculpts look absolutely top notch. Perhaps the most annoying things are the few remaining fine cast kits, things like Grotesques and the Drukhari Beasts, which you're far better off converting rather than buying direct from Games Workshop, just because they're truly ridiculous prices if you do want to field a unit of them in-game. Talking of prices though, largely it's not too bad. In particular, they're really quite nicely helped out by their Combat Patrol box. It contains a lot of decent units for the faction, all at a decent discount, and you could easily buy multiple copies of it to get towards a 2,000 point army. Their rules come from a recent 9th edition codex. They do have a supplement in the Witch Cult of Strife in one of the Warzone Charadon books, which, as always with the supplements, is definitely secondary to actually getting the codex, though if you are running that cult, the extra rules it brings are quite good. Traditionally, the Drukhari are a fairly fragile army, but have some of the best mobility in the game, and when they get there they hit very hard indeed. It's particularly represented by their Power from Pain rule, which allows them to advance and charge from Battle Round 2, and the more the bloodshed continues, the more stacking buffs they get. Usually this means fairly fragile infantry units striking out of Raiders or Venoms, though you certainly can go very heavily on the Homunculus Covens and put down some Tortured Pain engines, still move up the board at least relatively quickly, and take damage a lot better. At time of recording, I'd argue that the Drukhari are perhaps the strongest army in the game. They've already received a fair few nerfs since their codex came out, but the latest round of rebalancing made their Homunculus Coven units even stronger than they were before, and now they're a serious challenge to play against. I wouldn't be too surprised to see some more balance changes to them in the future. I bet the Coven units are going to go up a bit in points cost again. In any case, if you want to play a whole horde of murderous Dark Elves in space, the Drukhari could be a good choice. Your enemies will be praying that you don't take them alive. For our third flavour of Eldar, we come to the Harlequins. These enigmatic masked performers are the Eldar guardians of the Black Library, and often attach themselves to Eldar warbands, often found both amongst the Craftworlders and the Drukhari. They perform tales from Eldar mythology with dazzling acrobatics, which they can absolutely make full use on the battlefield, confounding the foe with unlikely movements, and making great use of holo fields and flip belts to always keep the foe fighting on the back foot. Miniatures wise, the Harlequins are a bit of a niche faction and have quite a small range. Again, like a few of the other smaller ones, it mainly consists of 3 kits: their troops kit, their jet bags, and their slightly bigger transport. Other than that, it's a few fine cast characters, so most of their armies do tend to be fairly similar, either troops fighting from their transports, or shoals of jet bikes attacking the foe, often with haywire cannons. The sculpts are fairly nice, though I would bear in mind that if you want to copy the box art, then you're going to need a steady hand for those diamonds. Not that you can't paint them in a slightly more simple style if you'd like. Price-wise, again I'd say they're kind of intermediate for 40k. For light infantry models, they are fairly expensive, but at the same time each Harlequin does cost a fair amount of points as well. They don't have any start collecting or discount bundles available at the moment, so what you see price-wise is pretty much what you get. Currently their rules are split between their 8th edition codex, plus a White Dwarf supplement that came out for them, which gave them really quite a lot of extra options, including pivotal roles for their characters, and certain stratagems. I'm not sure if the White Dwarf is still available, though I believe that you can gain access to them via the Warhammer app if you want to, though I'd be aware that that is a subscription service. Currently, as quite a small faction, Harlequins are rumoured to be getting folded in within the Eldar Codex, much in the same way as the Tempestus Scions did with the Guard once upon a time. To be honest, I can see that being the case. They do feel like a range that Games Workshop would have done more with if they were going to, but they haven't had many major releases for the Harlequins for quite some time, aside from one model that was attached to the Sisters of Battle. I'm sure they'll get some fairly decent support in the Craftworld Codex if they do go there, but I'd guess it might be a little bit less than they get as their full own independent Codex plus supplement. Playstyle wise, the Harlequins are very fast and flexible. You don't get all that many miniatures, and they don't have amazing damage characteristics for their points, but they make up for that for basically never ever fighting the foe on their own terms. You can advance and charge, fall back and charge, and they've got a couple of annoying tricks to hit the enemy hard and then zoom away to safety. Currently a lot of people seem to run them with the melee jet bikes and a fair few fusion pistols in the Starweavers. Power wise, I'd say they're a fairly medium army in 40k. They were initially really strong at the start of 9th edition, but they have been codex creeped a bit. I feel they're the kind of army that are going to be insanely strong in the hands of a really good player, maybe a bit more mediocre if you're just learning the faction. Perhaps an army that you need to get positioning very right with. In any case, if you want to hit the enemy very fast and hard with a colourful kaleidoscope of Eldar performers, then the Harlequins might be for you. Moving on and coming to the last Eldar army in the super faction, we come to the Ynnari, a relatively recent progression in the Eldar storyline, a kind of Eldar death cult worshipping Enid, the god of the dead, who is said to grow stronger and stronger as more Eldar pass away, hopefully to the point where it can defeat Slaanesh once and for all. The Ynnari have followers amongst the Craftworld's Drukhari and Harlequins, and often make war with a mix of the factions of these three races, their efforts often coordinated by Yvraine. Miniatures wise, as a bit of a composite weird faction, the Ynnari just use the miniatures from the other Eldar factions. There's only some choices that they're locked out of, things like certain Phoenix Lords and the Homunculus Covens. The only dedicated miniatures that they have are these three characters, the Vizarch, Yvraine, and the Incarn Avatar. You can potentially pick these all up in the same box set for a decent chunk worth of your army, but otherwise they're basically going to cost the same as the other Eldar factions. For their current rules, you would at least need one of the Eldar codexes, and I believe the most recent published Ynnari rules are in the Blood of the Phoenix expansion book, where you get things like their warlord traits, psychic powers, and stratagems. Again, much like the Harlequins, they're a mini-faction that are rumoured to be folded into the next Craftworld Codex, but we will have to wait and see whether or not that turns out to be true. Playstyle-wise, the Ynnari tend to be a melee-focused Eldar army, and often get a few different benefits, such as when models or units die. They have a few cool abilities, such as the Incarn teleporting around the battlefield to a destroyed squad, and fighting first when something in their army takes casualties. Despite these fun abilities though, they really are quite weak even by Eldar standards. I have seen some lists make use of things like the Incarn and Yvraine, but certainly compared with early 8th edition where they were running rampant with how strong they are kind of barely seen now. In any case, if a composite force of Eldar trying to bring about a new dawn for their race seems like a good theme to build a force around, then perhaps the Ynnari could be one to look at. Moving on to the other Xenos factions now, first we have the Tyranids. The Tyranids are the bugs from beyond the stars, the all-consuming Great Devourer, utterly unknowable alien horrors, with little indication as to just how many more there are to come out of the Great Void. Great hive fleets descend out of the blackness to feast upon worlds, shutting off all communication with the rest of the galaxy. A relentless assault of alien organisms swarming across the planet until all resistance lies broken, and then feeder organisms will strip the world bare of all biomass, funneling it into the fleet to move on to consume yet more worlds. Tyranid invasions tend to be of apocalyptic proportions, blacking out the sky beneath the wings of their organisms, and powerful synaptic creatures directing lesser organisms to carry out the hive mind's will. Miniatures wise, the Tyranids do have really quite an extensive range, but they haven't really had any new releases for quite a long time now. I believe that quite a lot of the effort that might have been invested into them has been invested into giving them an allied race in the Genestealer Cult. The vast majority of their models have aged really quite well, though maybe a few of them seem a bit dated even if they are quite iconic. Things like the Termagants and Genestealers could use an update, as could a few kits that are still made in resin. Price wise, again I think they're a fairly medium army as they go. You can create quite a few different flavours of Tyranid army, great swarms of bugs rushing the enemy, or hefty monster mash Nidzilla lists. Gameplay wise, they have an 8th edition 40k codex, but they have come out with quite a few quite powerful expansion rules for them. The Blood of Baal expansion has given a few powerful abilities such as adaptive physiology, and the recent Warzone Octarius supplement has given some Tyranid organisms powerful new synaptic links and a Leviathan supplement for that hive fleet. Most recently there was also an interesting formation in a White Dwarf that gave a Nidzilla list a lot of bite. The Crusher Stampede looks like it's going to be a really powerful way to field those bigger beasties. In general with Tyranids you are looking at either hordes or monsters or somewhere in between. The bugs come in all shapes and sizes, and despite appearances can still make some pretty fearsome range lists as well. Currently Hiveguard are one of the strongest shooting units in all of Warhammer 40k, though I'd not be amazingly surprised if they did get toned down at some point. In general I think that Tyranids do have the power to be one of the strongest armies in the entire game at the moment. Using Synaptic Links, the Leviathan supplement, and maybe that Crusher Stampede, between the three of those you can make some truly fearsome lists. In general though, if you want to swarm the galaxy beneath a carpet of bugs and devour everything in sight, then perhaps the Tyranids could be the choice for you. Closely related to the Tyranids, we have the Genestealer Cult, a rather interesting concept for an army that rises up from the underbelly of the Imperium. A Genestealer Patriarch will create an infestation in the underbelly of a hive world, and create a mutated following of cultists that insidiously spread throughout the planet's infrastructure, until the conspiracy grows so large that they're able to rise up and overthrow the planet's rulers. All of this is one of the more subtle tricks employed by the hive minds to render Imperial defences useless, as rather than a Tyranid hive fleet having to deal with difficult defences, it would be far easier if they could foment a rebellion, and then devour a planet once the guns have been silenced from within. In battle, the Genestealer Cults are a heavily guerrilla warfare fighting faction, making very good use of looted Imperial mining gear. Their various flavours of mutant, finding every way to lay the powerful warriors of the enemy low. Miniature-wise, the Genestealer Cult are also quite a recent army, a fairly nice new range of plastic kits, though it has to be said they all have a bit of an uncanny valley looking aesthetic, maybe towing the line just a little bit between unsettling and goofy. The sculpts are certainly realised pretty well though, they have plenty of options to choose from, and they can also make use of a fair few of the Imperial Guard kits as well, to represent them corrupting the planet's military as brood brothers. Price-wise, they again are unfortunately one of the more expensive 40k factions to collect. It comes with a relatively unfortunate combination of their troops being really quite cheap to field, yet quite expensive to buy a lot of. I feel they're perhaps one of the armies that you can get away with a fair few conversions for. I've certainly kit-bashed a few acolytes myself with bits from the Genestealer kit. Like the Custodes, their current rules are about to be redone in January. Hopefully we should have a new book very soon, which I will review on the channel. It's going to be interesting to see what changes for this army, where I feel that army-wide special rules are quite a big deal for. In general though, since their inception, they've always played as a bit of a guerrilla warfare army, units coming in from reserve, surprising the enemy, and maybe getting the jump on them with their ad hoc weaponry, with some very powerful characters that can give them big buffs and debuffs to their attacks. Most armies seem to want to include a mix of infantry and vehicles, though you could certainly go heavier on one than the other. In the past they have been an army that you could do quite well with as a horde. Power-wise, they currently are a bit on the weaker side, though I am absolutely certain that they will be far more dangerous with their new codex, as per the current trend with 9th edition. Overall though, if you like sneaky tricks and a bunch of alien hybrids rising up and taking down much more powerful warriors, then the Genestealer Cults could be the faction for you. Next up we come to the Tau Empire, an ambitious and young alien race, boundlessly expansionist, and seeking to bring as many alien races under the fold in their philosophy of the greater good. The Tau innovate and adapt far faster than the Imperium's stagnant technology, and they make war with great scientific achievements, mighty battlesuits, and crackling ion weapons with which to slay the foe at range. They've certainly got a bit of a manga vibe going for them. Though almost certainly isn't good news within the Tau Empire, they do have a slightly shadowy caste system, with the all-powerful ethereal caste exerting a form of mind control over their subjects. Despite a great concentration of Imperial might, they were not able to squash the fledgling Tau Empire, and now the spheres of expansion continue anew. Miniatures-wise, most of the Tau army is kind of medium age for 40k plastic kits, though I would say that most of the aesthetics have aged pretty well. They have had some of their more iconic units updated in recent times, Fire Warriors and the battlesuits not being all that long ago relatively speaking. Maybe some of their alien auxiliaries such as the Vestbeard and some of their resin kits such as the Sniper Drone team, they could perhaps use an update, but quite a lot of the range is still in nice plastic. Price-wise, I would say they are quite moderate again for 40k. Not super expensive, though not one of the cheapest factions either. You can play them as a somewhat elite faction if desired, and their start collecting box is quite good, getting you a bunch of battlesuits and fire warriors for a relatively low price. Their current rules are an 8th edition codex, though again there is one coming quite soon in 2022, so currently it's likely worth holding off for that one. Playstyle-wise, the Tau really are all about the ranged warfare. It seems to be a deliberate weakness of the faction that they have absolutely no presence in the psychic phase and not particularly strong combat either, so it's all about shooting the enemy to death, obliterating the foe with heavy firepower, and then hopefully take the objectives that they were sitting on. Quite a lot of their units are still geared to be risk takers though, charging in at close range and dealing out hefty damage, and I think that Games Workshop is largely trying to make Tau a little bit more about being dynamic and moving, rather than just sitting there and blowing away the enemy with big guns. They have the potential to go really heavy on the battlesuits, with entire cadres of XV8 bodyguards jumping around, bigger battlesuits like Storm Surges or Riptides, or perhaps even putting out some mechanised or vehicle lists with things like Hammerheads and Devilfish. I would bear in mind though that Tau can potentially be a little bit monodimensional. Still a fun faction to play, but I would bear in mind that you're not going to be doing much psychic or combat. Current power level wise is really quite weak, though as per normal with 9th edition, I'm absolutely certain they'll be far stronger once their codex releases. If you like the idea of a more optimistic and youthful alien race aggressively expanding their empire with high technology and massive firepower, then the Tau could be for you. Moving on to another race with boundless enthusiasm, we come to the Orks, violent fungoid greenskins and barbaric aliens that spread across the galaxy like a plague. For Orks, life is all about war, just for the sheer joy of it, and an Ork is never happier than charging into battle, chopper in hand, ready to break some skulls. Their war bosses lead them in great migrations called Wars, a great mass migration of greenskins across the galaxy, ready to stomp the stars under their iron-shod boots. Orc technology is particularly fun. It's cobbled together with bits and scraps made by their big mechs, and they frequently make use of looted bits from the other races that they fight, often cobbled together in great big creations of scrap. Miniatures-wise, the Orcs just received a really massive update a few months back. A lot of their older kits were revamped, and they've added a fun new line of Beast Snagger Orcs, savage, more primitive Orcs that generally make use of lower tech weapons, and have a fair few fun squig units which they ride into battle. Generally the Orc miniature line is just quite a fun one, ludicrously oversized combat weapons, and plenty of humour here and there with things like their Gretchen. Price-wise, again I'd say that they're fairly average for 40k. They've got a fair few models that have been around for quite a while and can get you a lot of points on the board for quite cheap. In particular, if you want to fill out an army really cheaply, a Stomper is one of the best ways to do that in all of 40k. But again, some of their newer shiny things are a little bit more expensive, particularly their unique buggies and a few of the Beast Snagger things. Currently, their rules are the recent 9th edition codex that didn't come out too long ago, and like a few of the other books, they already have a bit of expansion content. Warzone Octarius Critical Mass gives you a supplement for the Blood Axes and a new Speed Mob formation. Could be something to shake up and Standard Orc Army, though I'd say that both of them are completely not essential if you want to play the faction. Playstyle wise, Orcs can do a fair few army archetypes. Perhaps one of the strongest right now is Speed War, driving around with a whole load of buggies and planes shooting the enemy to death, or perhaps mixing up with a bit of that with a few kill rigs or other Beast Snagger units. They can be quite hoardy though, being a green tide, do a lot of walkers for a dread mob, or go for relatively elite builds like a whole load of mega knobs in battle wagons or trucks. Whatever you choose though, be prepared to roll buckets of dice. Orcs generally do tend to have a bit of a quantity not quality approach, particularly when shooting. Power wise, I'd certainly say that Orcs are pretty strong in 40k right now, particularly the Speed War and their shooting builds, even if they were toned down a little bit in the balanced data slate. They are perhaps maybe a codex without amazing internal balance. Quite a lot of units just seem a bit inferior to some of the better ones. They certainly wouldn't hurt to have a few points adjustments when Games Workshop do get round to it. In general though, if you just want to lead a whole bunch of hyper-violent greenskins in for a good scrap, then Orcs are a pretty fun army in 40k, and one that don't take themselves too seriously, which is pretty nice. Finally, and one of the poster boys of 9th edition itself, come the deathless Necrons. In ancient times, the Necrons used to be the Necrontyr, a short-lived and angry race that made war against the Old Ones in the War in Heaven. Their star god allies, the Catan, offered to swap their flesh for metal and grant them immortality, an offer which the Necrontyr accepted, not knowing that it would rob most of them of their souls and vitality. The vast majority of their population turned into mindless husks. In revenge, the Necrons betrayed and enslaved those star gods, before going into hibernation on their tomb worlds to wait out the eons, only now starting to reawaken in earnest and reclaim the empires that they once knew. In catacombs beneath many worlds thought dead or deserted, the Necrons are now starting to rise once more, silent hordes of living metal, unleashing ancient and unknowable technological horrors on the populaces of the worlds that they thought they owned. Miniatures-wise, the Necrons are in a pretty good spot right now. At the start of 9th edition, they had a really extensive range refresh with a massive amount of new plastic kits, a ton of new units, and a lot of the older ones redone in style. Like Space Marines, I would say that they're one of the cheaper armies to get into right now. They're present in the 40k starter sets, and a fair few of their miniatures are available second-hand, following the Indomitus box, which sold a whole ton of copies. They're also at least somewhat elite, which helps a bit too. Gameplay-wise, they received a codex right at the start of 9th edition, and in playstyle, they're largely all about being a durable army with regeneration. Things like resurrection orbs or technomancers can heal slain models to the squads, and injured vehicles get to regrow over time thanks to their living metal. They can do pretty solidly both at range and in melee now. A fair few new and powerful close combat units were added with the advent of their new codex. Currently, I put the Necron's power as kind of medium, maybe going a bit towards the stronger side since they had a recent update, where really quite a lot of their units gained the core keyword, and that's opened up a whole ton more combos. Necrons perhaps do suffer from early codex syndrome though. While they're strong compared with the 8th edition codexes, they're really not all that great compared with most of the 9th ones, and are perhaps looking a tiny bit lackluster compared with some of the more recent codexes that Games Workshop have unleashed. In any case though, if you want to stomp a legion of technologically advanced robot skeletons into battle and flay the living alive with the beams of your Gauss weaponry, then perhaps Necrons are the choice for you. So I think that just about brings us to the end of our overview of the armies of 40k. It's amazing how much there is to cover, even with a fairly succinct overview of each faction. Let me know which army you recommend and why down in the comments. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep regular 40k content coming. I usually have new videos coming out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the content on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and that's how I can afford to make quite so many videos quite so regularly. Massive great big ones like this do take an enormous amount of time to make. If you would like to help support new video creation, I do try and give a few rewards to channel backers, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help out, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.